While the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict grabs the most attention at this stage, it's undeniable that the relationship between China and the United States stands as the most crucial bilateral relationship globally, deeply impacting the trajectory of world affairs. Hence, currently, all eyes around the world are turning towards San Francisco. Following an intense round of positive interactions, the San Francisco summit has finally been arranged. From the current situation, the atmosphere seems quite favorable. Regardless of the ultimate outcomes achieved, the very occurrence of this summit marks progress in itself. Due to differences in ideological values and distinct strategic objectives, the two major powers, China and the US, are inherently contradictory. They are destined to contend for their respective interests. However, amid sluggish economic recovery, continuous crises in localized conflict, and imminent international challenges like addressing the climate crisis, cooperation stands as the international consensus and theme. In this video, we'll focus on recent international relations with China, reporting and discussing the following countries and regions: United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, United Kingdom. China and the US stand as the two most powerful and influential nations globally, and the state of their relationship directly affects the course of world affairs. Cooperation is challenging enough, let alone confrontation, in resolving global crises. Therefore, there's widespread hope for an improvement in Sino-American relations. Although it's unrealistic to expect that one or two meetings will completely erase the differences and contradictions between China and the US, convening meetings at critical junctures signifies that the conflict between the two won't escalate. Even a temporary truce implies a certain degree of damage control, which the world anticipates. The San Francisco summit is now confirmed. Judging from recent statements and comprehensive interactions, the summit should play a significant role in stabilizing Sino-American relations. It might even yield some collaborative achievements. Decoupling, risk aversion, or military pressure serve the purposes of slowing down China's development, pressuring China to sacrifice core interests, and disrupting China's broader external cooperation. However, these tactics have limited efficacy against China. Currently, the US hasn't been able to halt cooperation between developing countries and China. Instead, developing countries are reforming global governance mechanisms by establishing new collaborative models with China. This forms part of the competition to reshape the world order. In reality, global transformations are accelerating, and the geopolitical landscape is increasingly beyond US control, while China's influence continues to rise. The US likely aims to integrate China into its orbit, hitching China onto the train of the American order and allowing the US to lead. This way, China perpetually trails the US at the same speed, never overtaking it. This is the logic of the US. However, for the world, in a situation of severe economic stagnation and instability, there's a natural desire for China and the US to avoid exacerbating conflicts at this time. Otherwise, everyone will inevitably suffer. Despite the widespread global expectation for a thaw or stability in Sino-American relations, conflicting sentiments exist among Europe, the UK, Japan, and Korea. For Europe, dealing with issues related to China has always been a dilemma. Despite refusing decoupling and aiming for strategic autonomy, Europe hesitates to defy the United States. Hence, when the US proposes risk aversion, Europe promptly follows suit. Besides, Europe also aims to gain competitive advantages over China. At present, the New Zealanders seem the most astute. Though their cooperation with China isn't as extensive, they steadfastly avoid offending China. Australians also show some wisdom, timely repairing relations with China. They seize the initiative amidst the warming or stabilizing relations between China and the US. Although the contradictions between China and the US won't be resolved overnight and their competitive relationship won't be abandoned, once Sino-American relations thaw, a surge in cooperative endeavors obstructed by the US against China will quickly emerge. China's economy is stabilizing and resilient, impressing even the usually tough-minded Democratic Senate leader Schumer, who visited China, with its vitality and resilience. China is expanding its openness, continually enlarging its market, and promoting the establishment of a vast global cooperation platform. This massive market is considerably attractive, especially in a world where economies are struggling. Crucially, ASEAN, the African Union, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the 5 Central Asian countries, those involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, are significantly benefiting from their cooperation with China. They've gained an edge in the Chinese market and in collaborating with China. Although the European Union remains indecisive, recent developments show signs of urgency. Following Borrell's visit to China, just before the San Francisco summit, the EU's Internal Market Commissioner, Breton, also visited China. Moreover, EU Commission President von der Leyen recently hinted at an upcoming visit to China alongside European Council President Michel. Despite recent tension in Sino-European relations, it's partly due to external factors given the EU president's partial American heritage and internal divisions within the EU. Disputes and bickering hinder the unity necessary for a clear strategic approach toward China. Notably, the diverging opinions between France and Germany exacerbate these contradictions. Despite the EU's collective reluctance to actively engage with China, bilateral and multilateral cooperation between China and certain European countries remains largely unaffected. China signed substantial cooperation agreements with France and Germany last year. Greece, Italy, and other southern European countries also enjoy decent cooperation prospects with China. Collaboration between China and some Central and Eastern European countries is even more profound. In essence, Europe is testing alignment with the Belt and Road Initiative through the China-Europe Railway. The US has always sought to unite Europe under its influence as a crucial tool against China. Pushing for risk aversion seems evidently aimed at dividing Sino-European relations or impeding stronger Sino-European cooperation. The EU stands as the third largest economy after China and the US. As long as it doesn't entirely become a strategic tool for the US, it remains a target for China's efforts. It's long been recognized that Europe is a focal point of contention between China and the US. The issue now is that the EU refuses to lower its status for equal cooperation with China, fearing excessive economic reliance on China and avoiding a complete fallout with the US. Hence, there's resistance to allowing China's 5G entry into the EU market and imposing certain investment restrictions on China. There's also the investigation into anti-subsidy measures for electric cars. However, Europe faces severe trade disputes with the US, refuses to relinquish its strategic autonomy or embrace a multipolar world, and is firm in rejecting confrontational blocs. Hence, it's unlikely to entirely forsake its cooperative relations with China. As long as Sino-American relations improve or their economic and trade ties strengthen, the EU will inevitably accelerate its pace in cooperating with China. The EU's call for re-engagement with China signifies both its regard for Sino-European relations and its attempt to pressurize China into compromise, possibly to avoid diminishing its own significance. Regardless, where there's willingness, there's potential for dialogue. Where dialogue exists, there are ways to resolve disputes. If China and the US can cooperate, collaboration between China and Europe should naturally follow suit. The crucial aspect is to bolster cooperation with China. It can alleviate the EU's declining pressures and reduce dependence on the US, fostering greater strategic autonomy for the EU. It's not just the EU actively engaging with China at this time. Japan and South Korea are feeling the pressure too. Recently, they pushed for trilateral talks involving China, Japan, and Korea, obviously aiming to get closer to China. The news of a possible meeting between China and the US in San Francisco immediately unsettled Japan. On the 9th, Wang Yi met with Japan's Cabinet Special Advisor and National Security Council Chief, Gang Manikia, in Beijing, conducting consultations within the China-Japan high-level political dialogue mechanism. Whether the high-level political dialogue mechanism can be established depends on Japan's actions. The crux of China-South Korea relations doesn't solely rest on their relationship with China but rather on the growing anti-China sentiments within South Korea. There's even contemplation of introducing U.S. nuclear deterrence onto the peninsula. This move undeniably deepens the rift between China and South Korea. In the previous showdown between China and the US, there inevitably had to be sacrifices or venting. Unfortunately, it seems like South Korea might become the sacrifice. The situation on the Korean peninsula affects China's national security and development environment. Previous instances of instability were often directly related to South Korea's provocative actions. Primarily, the imbalance in power between North and South Korea has a role. To maintain long-term stability on the peninsula, there's a need to rebalance the power dynamics. For the UK, China is currently under a cold front too. The key issue in Sino-UK relations is the UK's persistent desire for military involvement in Asia-Pacific affairs, even intervening in the Taiwan Strait issue, which irks China. Despite the UK Foreign Secretary's visit to China, the overwhelming reliance on the US prevents taking any action before the China-US summit. Additionally, extreme political divisions within the UK force caution from Sunak in making premature statements or taking action. Since China's focus is on the EU, naturally, it leads to cooling relations with the UK. In summary, it's not so much that the San Francisco summit marks a turning point in Sino-US relations, but rather a turning point in global affairs. The interactions between China and the US have put those countries that once held hostility towards China in an extremely awkward position. The hesitant EU is hastening its steps to re-engage with China. Similarly, Japan and South Korea are quite anxious. Previously hoping to leverage or showcase themselves using the US's influence against China, they're now seeking communication and dialogue with China. The key concern is the fear of being marginalized amidst the shift in global affairs driven by China and the US. Australia sets a positive example, while South Korea might become a negative one. Developing countries or those actively strengthening cooperation with China now have more confidence in collaborating with China. The San Francisco summit doesn't signify China's intimidation but rather its responsible image and status as a major global power. China is leveraging its strength and position to drive global change and establish a new system of cooperation and governance. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.